One of the most fascinating parts of taking these early period history classes was seeing that anticipation build up in my students. It's almost like a vivid memory, and it's something that has repeated itself quite a few times in all these classes that I've taken, where I can see in their eyes that the moment they realize that we are tracing the geological timescale, even though we're not going into too much details, we're still tracing the geological timescale, right? And then they would start researching or anticipating when we would reach the Mesozoic so that we can talk about the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous period, and in fact start talking about dinosaurs. And that fascination is quite relatable because I remember myself being so fascinated when I first thought about dinosaurs. The first time I encountered them through encyclopedias and then inadvertently watching the Jurassic Park movies. I remember being so enthralled, so fascinated by the existence of such epic creatures. They looked the way they looked. They were huge. They had these huge set of teeth. They walked. Some of them were bipedal. Some of them, the sauropods, were huge. And it almost felt like it was out of fantasy, right? Because it's very hard to believe the existence of creatures so big and so epic when you look back into the fossils and the geological timescale that something like this actually walked the same earth that you and I do today. It's fascinating. It is. And for us to reach there, we were just talking about biomineralization in the last podcast, where we spoke about how evolution was making its own way through different periods, through a lot of turmoil that the earth was throwing towards it. And to quote Jurassic Park right here, where I think it was Ian Malcolm who says, life finds a way, right? That life keeps on evolving and evolution keeps on finding a way of overcoming the challenges that the natural environment throws at it. And that's exactly what has been happening in this whole geological timescale that you and I have been tracing, to a point where we finally reached the process of biomineralization, where creatures were finally evolving to create a hard exoskeleton to help them stay alive against predators. And it almost became like an evolutionary arms race where the better skeleton you have, the more chances of survival you have. And with that natural selection process, more and more organisms started coming with this whole modification of biomineralization. Now, that same evolution would happen towards the predator side as well, where because your shells are getting harder, so a predator would find it difficult to consume you as food. So they'll have to evolve a better set of jaws, a better set of teeth, a better set of claws, much more stronger with much more power to consume that food. So this whole evolutionary arms race was happening both on the side of the prey as well as the predator, right? And this is where we were. We were talking about the end of Ediacaran and we were starting the Cambrian Explosion period, quote unquote, because I told you that the whole idea of explosion doesn't really occur right where the Cambrian start. In fact, it's 530 million years or so is where we can say that, okay, there is now suddenly a huge amount of evolution happening. And that's also because the fossils from this period start to become quite diverse in nature. And we spoke about like the star fossils of this time period, which were the Trilobites. And alongside them, we had striated clams, nut-like brachiopod shells, and delicate fan-like the bryozoas, the porous sponges, and horn-shaped corals. And all of this are preserved in layers after layers of sedimentary rocks across the globe. In fact, there's this really cool site in Teuth in Morocco where you would find that as you start walking by the Source River, there would be limestones which would mark very distinctly the end of Ediacaran and the beginning of the Cambrian. Because when you start looking at those limestone formations, you'd see that they look like normal. There is nothing in there. Layers upon layers of these sedimentary reddish-brown limestones are there, which without any fossils. And suddenly, you'll find this layer which would look no different from a distance. But when you go close to it, you'll start seeing these very well preserved fossils, and one of those fossils is of the Ephilothraspis, which is one of the very first earliest trilobites that was found. And then as you keep walking and looking at layers above it, because we know that if we look layers above, that means a time which came after, you'll start seeing other distinctive species of trilobites like the Chaupertella and the Dagonaspis. So this whole evolution can be traced like that, and this is something that we've spoken about in the earlier episodes as well, where we know that how the people were looking at sedimentary rocks and how they started looking at the formations of these fossils, and the occurrence of these fossils is how we essentially got our geological timescale. And now from this point onwards, the fossil records and everything become quite vibrant, because the type of species that we get, and especially thanks to the hard exoskeletons of these creatures from this point onwards, from 535 million years ago onwards, we start finding fossils which are much more telling, which has much more features, and it helps us really mark the evolution and change. And that's why these sedimentary rocks become so important for us. Now, coincidentally, you would find that a lot of these discoveries of fossils initially were happening by mistake, through accidents, because a lot of these digs that would happen in search of resources like coal. And it's fascinating because most of these dramatic layered rock formations where you find these fossils are usually occurring alongside these economically valuable fossil fuels. Now, isn't it interesting that coal is known as a fossil fuel? And we're talking about fossils. So there is a very hard-lined connection right here, which is that coal is nothing but prehistoric carbon formations, right? These coals were developed through a process that started 300 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. And during this time period, Earth was covered in wide, shallow seas. And these seas occasionally flooded the forested areas, trapping plants and algae at the bottom of the swampy wetlands. And over time, these plants, mostly mosses and algae, were buried and compressed under the weight of the overlaying mud and vegetation. And as this plant debris shifted deeper into the Earth's surface, it encountered increased temperatures and higher pressures. Mud and acidic water prevented this plant matter from coming into contact with oxygen. And with this, and at a very slow rate of decomposition, this plant material ended up retaining a lot of its carbon. And through time, these buried plant matter became peat bogs. And these peat bogs are still used for energy in places like Scotland and Ireland and Russia. And then with the right conditions, these peat formations turned into coal through a process called carbonization. Carbonization takes place under incredible heat and pressure, and about 3 meters of or 10 feet of this peat would get converted into 1 meter of this very highly compacted black material that you know as coal. Now, this coal that we spoke about, which was formed 300 million years ago or so, it is commonly found sandwiched between layers of sandstone, which are in turn bounded by shale. Now, such a sequence, shale, sandstone, coal, sandstone, shale, repeated over and over, implies that significant shifts in the sea level as it drops and then rises and then drops again, perhaps in response to the retreat and advance of the polar ice caps and glaciers, was happening. An inescapable conclusion is that for hundreds of millions of years, ocean depths have repeatedly varied by hundreds of feet. Now, to the modern humans with our immense coastal cities and vast seaside infrastructure, the height of the ocean seems to be fixed at a global level. It doesn't really change that much, but obviously with the whole idea of global warming, we have been made aware of rising sea levels, but it still doesn't seem so drastic. At least not as drastic as what we are comparing in this whole timescale of millions of years, right? Now, it's hard to imagine the change of even 10 feet, much less hundreds of feet. But the recent sedimentary record is unambiguous at this point. Within the last few tens of thousands of years, the oceans have been at levels more than 150 feet higher, and they have also been less than 300 feet below what they are today. So without any possible doubt, with such change, this will keep coming and going and radically alter the shape of continents and coastlines. And that is a story that is told by rocks and their fossils and ecosystem, and that is what we see. And this was very much part of the evolution, as we'll see going forward, be it the dinosaurs, be it those big leafy plants. This cycle continues. It was happening and it is still going on. So, at this point, we know that the coal helps us trace the evolutionary process through these sedimentary layers. It tells us where the stratification happens and consequently where the particular fossils occur and which are the newer ones, which are the old ones. So, coal is almost like a marker for us. And then, secondly, we have the whole idea of rise or change in sea levels, which acts as a natural selection catalyst, which is really pushing the evolution forward through drastic changes in the biosphere, right? Now, keeping these two things in mind, let's start looking at how that evolutionary process actually happened. Let's look at how these water-dwelling small insect like trilobites transform gradually into these huge globe-spanning dinosaurs, right? Now, the most dramatic terrestrial transformation in Earth's history had to await the rise of land plants because we didn't have it till then. And it was an innovation that is recorded as distinctive, sturdy, microscopic fossil spores in rocks as old as 475 million years ago. See, during this time period, most of the fossils were soft-bodied. Most of the organisms were soft-bodied. So, no body fossils of the delicate, easily decaying vegetation from this time can be found. But what we do find are those rootless, ground-hugging descendants of green algae that could have survived in low and wet places. And soon after, about 430 million years ago, a significant change in the global diversity of spore fossil point towards a marked shift in the distribution of land plants. And then, over the next 30 million years, the liverwort-like spores become less abundant, while those similar to modern mosses and simple vascular plants, they assume more dominance. Now, rock of this interval from Scotland, Bolivia, China, and Australia also hold the oldest known unambiguous fossils of the plants themselves, the fragmentary remains of club mosses and other suspected relatives of these modern vascular plants that we see today. So, the fossil records improve with time, as we've seen. And as early plants become more widespread and robust, we start seeing more and more of these fossils. Now, by 400 million years ago, primitive vascular plants had begun to colonize these barren, red, big, huge swaths of land across the globe. They appear as spindly, leafless miniature shrubs with greenish photosynthetic stems and the branches that rose just a few inches above the ground. Their roots efficiently penetrated the rocky ground and provided a sturdy anchor while the capillary action distributed water upwards. And I really want you to think about this time period. Around 400 million years or so ago, the leaf wasn't still invented by the plants. There were no leaves. They were all these thorny projections, right? And the root system also was just developing. And from this point onwards, the moment we start looking at this, the moment we start getting leaves and deep-rooted plants, even that factor itself will completely change how the weathering process happens on Earth. See, in spite of their obvious importance to life's colonization on land, fossilized plants have long played second fiddle to all these dinosaurs and predators that we've spoken about. These predators, they move, they hunt, they eat, and they are more fascinating. But what we have to realize, it was these plants who actually made that possible. Because once plant or food started becoming available on land, it gave incentive to all these ocean-dwelling species to actually walk up and come to the land, right? And that's what happens. Also, there is this curious case of the prototaxites, which I came across in Robert Hassan's book, which were basically these huge 25-foot tree-like organisms. Now, when detailed study was done of these organisms, they found out that these were actually not plants. These were some sort of a fungi. So you can imagine, about the 400 million years ago, the Earth's landscape was at least a little bit of green, but it was completely alien because it had huge long fungus, it had scrubby star-like plants, and it had very few small insects and spider-like animals. And all of this was about to change with the invention of leaves. Now, the invention of these tiny leaves, these energy-tapping resources, it took quite some time to evolve. We see that it took about tens of millions of years to go from those thorny, needle-like structures to actually becoming proper leaves. And the moment this evolution happened, the moment leaves became a common feature, we see in a span of about 40 million years or so, by 360 million years ago, we have huge trees and huge forests emerge as a utterly new terrestrial ecosystem. And for the first time in history, Earth's land was actually emerald green in color. Now, weathering rates, like I was talking about before, of many surface rocks, including basalt, granite, limestone, they would completely increase by an order of magnitude as a consequence of the roots and their rapid modes of biochemical breakdown because of these roots penetrating into these sedimentary rocks. And this is very important for us. See, the resultant soil, rich in clay, minerals, organic matter, and a host of microorganisms became deeper and more widespread and provided an ever-expanding habitat for more and larger plants and fungi to flourish. And there's a particular reason why I'm giving so much importance to the root system. It's because even in those root systems, there was a new symbiotic relationship that was forming between the plant roots and this new network of fungal filaments called mycorrhiza. And I'm pretty sure if you are a student of biology, you've heard of mycorrhiza because these are very important. They are those small fungal plants that efficiently extract phosphate and other nutrients from the soil and pass them to the plant. And the plant in itself, it provides the fungi with a steady diet of energy-rich glucose and other carbohydrates. And this symbiotic relationship is extremely important for the health of the plants. And that is what helped the plants grow as big and spread as much as they did. Now let's also discuss about our stars of evolution, right? Because we know that as the terrestrial landscape is now getting filled with green, nutrient-rich plants, we will have animals also coming and trying to colonize this. Now, initially, we know that invertebrates were the very first ones to actually become terrestrial. This would include insects, spiders, worms, and other small creatures. Now, looking back towards the trilobite that we left behind, from there, a lot of other branches of invertebrates were emerging. And of this, the very first initial vertebrate appeared in the guise of primitive jawless fish, which was about 500 million years ago. And then this jawless fish went into a complete evolutionary change over the next 100 million years or so in the ocean before they first took the step towards colonizing dry land. Now, recall that biological arms race we were talking about, which was happening under the ocean. Now, 420 million years ago, we know that biomineralization had reached a point where there were hard-shelled fishes and bony vertebrates which were there. And to hunt them down, there were these vicious alien-looking armored fishes which were also coming up with bony plated jaws around this time period. Now, much more familiar cartilaginous sharks and bony fish appeared and diversified over the next 20 million years, from 420 million years to about 400 million years. But the dry land was still utterly devoid of any vertebrates during this point. Now, the recent discovery of a 395 million year old fossil fish in China provides the earliest sign of the evolutionary transition from fins to four-footed land animals. And this transition is going to be gradual. So I want you to picture this 20 million years, the next 20 million years, to be a period where these fishes are sort of coming close to the shore, sometimes taking a few steps outside on the land and then going back into the water because they are still water breathing, right? They are still not accustomed to breathing the air. A few fish developed primitive lungs and ventured onto land for a longer and longer stay, but many millions of years passed before the first bony animal felt fully at home breathing air. And the oldest known fossil bones of a four-legged land animal, a walking fish with fin-like feet, come from rocks about 375 million years old. So you can see the evolution is happening gradually, and it's happening at a pace that is much higher than what we were seeing before. And this particular evolution time period, from a fish to an amphibian, has been a delight of paleontologists across the world because there are so many fossils from China to Pennsylvania which marks the gradual transition towards this particular transformation, right? And I want you to imagine this, that through evolution, these vertebrates who were so accustomed to being in the ocean, who were accustomed to reproduce underwater, to breathe underwater, to listen underwater, to eat underwater, they were about to completely change their ecosphere, right? They were about to become what we see as these primitive land animals categorized by broad, flat skulls, equipped with splayed legs, five-toed feet, ears suited for listening in air, and other terrestrial adaptations, which clearly differentiated them from their fish ancestors. So by the Carboniferous period, Earth's solid surface had for the first time evolved to a strikingly modern appearance, with dense green forests of tall fern-like trees, these swarms, lush meadows populated with ever-widening cast of insects, amphibians and other creatures. And thanks to the profound influence of life, Earth's near-surface rocks and minerals had also achieved something akin to the modern state of diversity and distribution. And mind you, the way there was evolution that was happening for plants and animals and mineral composition, that doesn't mean the Earth itself wasn't moving. There was tectonic movements that was happening. The climate was changing. You would see there were droughts, there were floods, there was these odd one or two asteroid impacts that also happened during this time period. There were super volcanic eruptions that happened during this time period. So all of these things were happening, but Earth and its biota have proven unfailingly resilient to such insults. Because just as Ian Malcolm's character said in Jurassic Park, life kept on finding a way, and it kept on finding a way and kept on going. Now, something really interesting starts happening around this time period. We are at the 300 million years ago mark, where we know that the Earth's forests are flourishing, and they're flourishing to a point where they are creating so much leafy biomass that it would end up creating a completely new rock type down the line, known as coal, right? That's why this is known as the Carboniferous period. Now, one consequence of having so much leafy biomass is that there was a lot of carbon sequestration happening because of this large-scale photosynthesis that is going on. You would see that there was a gradual rise in the level of oxygen during this time period, just the way it happened during the Neoproterozoic oxidation event as well. You would see that around 380 million years ago, there was 18% of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere, which became 25% by 350 million years ago mark. And by 300 billion years ago, we reached the 30% mark of oxygen in our atmosphere in terms of percentage, right? And it wouldn't be even wrong to say that there was a point in time where there could have been even more than 35% of oxygen. And all of this is not a guess. There are proper evidences, and the evidence is also quite curious. Because if doing a callback to the Jurassic Park movies, if you remember how the movie opens, they were talking about how there was a mosquito which was trapped in an amber, and the blood was extracted from that mosquito, which had the DNA of the dinosaurs, right? Very cool, very interesting way of looking at it. But something very similar happened when we were actually looking at these fossils, because we found these beautiful specimens of Carboniferous age amber, which fossilized the atmospheric bubbles of that time period. And when we looked at the composition of the atmosphere during this time period, we saw that it had 30% or more oxygen in it. So the rise in oxygen had quite a beneficial consequence to animal life as well. More oxygen meant more energy and increased rate of metabolism. And some creature took the advantage of this extra oxygen and became quite large. Now, this is not the reason why the gigantism in dinosaurs happened. That is something that we'll deal later down in the podcast, where we'll actually talk about why dinosaurs got as big as they did. But during this time period, we are quite far away from dinosaurs, by the way. We are at around the 300 million years ago mark. So during this time period, you would still see that most dramatic were the giant insects. They were exemplified by monster dragonflies with like 2-foot wingspans, and the increased oxygen also enhanced the atmospheric density, which made flying and gliding that much easier. Other animals undoubtedly migrated to previously uninhabitable higher elevations with thickening air, because they could now breathe in those habitats, and those habitats also started becoming quite habitable for them. So for a span of tens of millions of years, life on this Pangean supercontinent was flourishing. The climate was benign, the resources were plentiful, and life evolved without any care. But then, rather suddenly and mysteriously, around 251 million years ago, life collapsed. The collapse was so big that we ended up giving this the name of the Great Dying. Now, talking about it, let's look back. For the past 540 million years or so, we know that the fossil records have piled up. We've seen the profligate biological species that have come up with like hundreds and thousands of known fossil species of corals, of crinoids, of brachiopods, of bryozoas, of clams, snails, and not to mention the vast numbers of microscopic animals that were coming in. Now, specialists, they estimate that the diversity in excess of about 20,000 known species of trilobites, with dozens or more described every year. And telling you this to make you understand the scale of things, right? Because let's look at trilobites themselves. They were on Earth for 180 million years, from about 430 million years to about 250 million years ago or so. So that's an average of a new trilobite species every few thousand years. So taking all the rich diversity of fossil life into account, several new species must have appeared on an average every century for more than 500 million years. So every century. So what's not so immediately obvious from this fossil record are a few stark episodes of mass deaths that suddenly resulted in extinction of millions of species. And these mass extinction events are not very easy to spot because they're not as flashy as the very first discoveries of species, right? They're not like the very first snail has been discovered, the very first amphibian or the very first snake has been discovered. Because the moment you find that species, you put it in the fossil record and you know the date to trace it from. But when it comes to these mass extinction events, it requires a tedious, meticulous teasing out of fossil diversity layer by layer and then time interval by time interval. Given that there were many advances and retreats of the ocean, the opening and closing of shallow seas, the slowing of sedimentation during the cool periods, and the irreversible losses owing to erosion, the whole rock records for these mass extinction events are quite spotty and incomplete. They're almost like you're reading a book and suddenly someone has torn pages out. Right, the records suddenly either disappear or ages and stratas of fossil records are not there. So, keeping that in mind, what we finally discovered was that there were 5 major extinction events that occurred in this time period of the last 540 million years ago or so. And there were other minor events also, which were less damning, and there must have been around 15 or so these smaller extinction events, but these extinction events were still happening. So by the end of the Paleozoic era, which is around 251 million years ago, we witnessed the greatest mass extinction of all. An estimated 70% of the land species and a whopping 96% of the marine species vanished. This was the disastrous global event that was known as the Great Dying. And the thing is, never before or never since in Earth's history have so many creatures just disappeared forever. And the mysterious thing about this Great Dying is that scientists aren't yet agreed on what caused the Great Dying. It certainly wasn't as simple as a random asteroid coming and crashing and doing all of this. Nor did it occur all at once. Multiple reinforcing stress factors might have come into play. See, for one thing, oxygen levels had begun to drop rapidly from their Carboniferous high of about 35%. So by 251 million years ago or so, they were back to roughly 20%. That's enough oxygen to support complex animal life, but the drop perhaps added a stress to animals that were adapted to this high oxygen environment. Now, during the same time period as the oxygen levels were going down, we also see that there was an episode of global cooling that happened, which resulted in a moderate ice age of sorts. It wasn't as severe as the one that we saw during the Neo-Proterozoic period, not like the snowball Earth, but we still had thick ice covering the south polar portions of Pangaea. Now, with this ice age came the drop in ocean levels, and with the drop of ocean levels, you'll have these new continental shelves being completely exposed. And these continental shelves are the ocean's most productive biosphere. So the loss of this large fraction of those shallow coastal zones would also have restricted the growth of coral reefs, which would have then eventually completely disrupted the whole marine ecosystem. Added to all of this was the large-scale volcanism at the end of the Paleozoic era, almost exactly coincident with the mass extinction of the 251 million years ago, which represents yet another major disruption of Earth's biosphere. See, the protracted mega eruptions of as much as 1 million cubic miles of basalt in Siberia, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, must have severely compromised the Earth's environment. For hundreds and thousands of years, pulses of volcanic ash and dust would have reduced the sun's input and exacerbated this whole ice age. The release of huge quantities of toxic sulfur compounds would have led to acid rain, which would have further deteriorated the whole environment. Now, as if that wasn't enough, recent studies have pointed out that the rocks which come from the end of Paleozoic era, be it in Antarctica, Greenland, Siberia, we find that there is big evidences of the depletion of the ozone layer. which could have happened because of the chemical reactions from the volcanic ashes that was reaching above the stratosphere. But all in all, it also wasn't great because now at this point, most of the biomass was exposed to the dangerous UV rays, right? And I somehow thematically keep coming back to that whole quote of the Jurassic Park because we know that all of these causes would have led to the Great Dying, and the Great Dying did happen. We did lose a lot of biodiversity because of the Great Dying. But like the adage, life kept on finding a way. So in the next 30 million years or so, there was a recovery, and this recovery happened, and this recovery was great. And this is the recovery you and I are here for. See, dinosaurs came on the scene about 230 million years ago as beneficiaries of the end of this Paleozoic mass extinction. These fascinating creatures, they started slow, and eventually they were occupying every ecological niche over a span of another 160 million years or so. Now, let's not forget that dinosaurs are one of many of these charismatic faunas from the Mesozoic period. In fact, the Mesozoic period had its own trilobites in the form of ammonites. Their shells were stunningly beautiful. There were these cephalopods which had this spiral symmetry, and they had this very iridescent surface. And unlike trilobites, ammonite shells can't provide a realistic picture of the complete creature because they did have some soft body parts. But we know that, yes, the ammonites started existing from this point onwards. The Mesozoic era also saw many other important biological developments, and one of those biggest developments was the flowering plant, because this is where flowering plants first started appearing. And so did true mammals. And as with every other significant chunk of Earth's history, there were many changes in geography and topography that was also happening. So you would see that during this time period, Pangaea began to break up, and the Atlantic Ocean was born. Atmospheric oxygen levels continued to drop at dangerously low levels at 15%, and only to rebound roughly to the present value of 21% later, right? We also see that during this time, the sea level fell and rose, and this happened over and over again. And surprisingly, there are no particular mass glaciation periods during the Mesozoic era, nothing compared to what we saw during the Paleozoic or even before. But even during this time period, things weren't very great. We already start seeing echoes of the end Paleozoic extinction event. We see that there are mass volcanic eruptions happening in India, which would have drastically altered the Earth's atmosphere. And in similar fashion, we see there was a big change in sea level. A big drop appears to have exposed much of the continental shelf at about that same time, upsetting the ocean food web and killing off all but 8 known ammonite species out of thousands. So the reasons for such a sea level change are not all obvious, but there was no ice age at the time. Some scientists speculate that the mid-ocean ridges could have become less active, causing cooling and contraction and consequent sinking of the entire ocean floor. But all in all, we know that the situation wasn't that great. And then comes the little cherry on top. See, this time period that we're talking about, which is 65 million years ago, we find a random asteroid about 9.5 kilometers long come and strike the Yucatan Peninsula. And it resulted into a huge mega tsunami which ended up sweeping across the globe, across all the continents. And then the resultant vaporized rocks that ended up going to the atmosphere, it completely blacked out the atmosphere to a point where there was no photosynthesis happening. And with all the volcanic stuff happening and the drop in sea levels, this ended up causing the next extinction event. And this is the extinction event that ends up completely killing off the dinosaurs, leaving behind just one minor lineage of theirs, which were the birds. And just as in the same fashion that we had seen at the end of the Paleozoic extinction event and how it gave way to the dinosaurs, this end Mesozoic extinction event gave the same footing to mammals. So within 10 million years of the Indian mega volcano eruptions and the coincident asteroid impact, mammals had diversified, and within 15 million years, you would find that early ancestors of whales, bats, horses, and elephants had evolved. So it was this mass extinction that repeatedly challenged and winnowed life on Earth. Now, before we go from here towards humans, I do want us to look into one specific question that I've always had and I've always asked when it came to the dinosaurs, which was the reason behind their gigantism. We know that dinosaurs were huge, be it the theropods like the Tyrannosaurus, the Spinosaurus, or the sauropods like the Patagotitans or the Titanosaurus. They were huge. So how did they become so big? Now, the initial research was pointing towards oxygen being the main culprit for their gigantism, right? That there was such oxygen-rich environment that they became big. But from what you and I have just traced in our geological timescale, we saw that by the end of the Mesozoic period, the oxygen levels were not very great. They had sunken really, really far down to 15%, and they just started rising up. So oxygen could not have been the factor for the gigantism. But this is not a cope. Okay, I'm not saying that we have all the answers for the gigantism, but there are certain studies that have been done which point out to other factors which could have made this sort of possible. See, when we look at let's take sauropods for example. Sauropods were the biggest dinosaurs to ever exist. When we look at them, we see there were certain physiological changes that really helped them be big. One of the biggest ones of these was their upright stance. See, the dinosaurs, they would stand upright. This could support a large body better than the sprawling stance of other reptiles like lizards and crocodiles. This meant that less energy was consumed when they were standing. And all dinosaurs, they shared this body shape advantage. But while 2 legs were good for running, and so all predator dinosaurs were bipedal, 4 legs can support much larger body weight. So that's the reason why the biggest bipedal dinosaurs like the Spinosaurus or Tyrannosaurus or the Gigantosaurus, they only weighed about 7 tons, whereas these massive sauropods, because they walked on 4 legs, they were 8 to 10 times heavier than these. Similarly, they had a unique hand and feet design. Just like how we see in elephants, how they have these spongy, shock-absorbing, padded, huge feet, same things were happening with the sauropods. Now, if we look more into their physiology, you would find that they had wider hips. Wider hips helped them have a much bigger stomach, a sizable size of a stomach, and a bigger belly basically meant that they could obtain more energy and nutrition from plants they ate because they could have the whole digestion process to go on longer. Now, usually when digestion process is going that long, metabolism might make them heat up a lot, but to regulate that, they had really good breathing systems and they had this efficient bird-like breathing, which by that, what I mean is, a lot of these dinosaurs had lighter bones, which are related to the bird-like breathing system. Lighter bones of sauropods and theropods contained air sacs, which worked as lungs because they would have oxygen being stored in them. And the combination of these air sacs and lungs meant dinosaurs were supplied with oxygen even as they were breathing out. See, this is the same effect that happens when you have birds flying over the Himalayan mountains, which helps them breathe even in less denser air. So dinosaurs had this as well. They had these lighter bones, these hollow bones, which really helped. This pneumatic bone system really helped. And then finally, they were quite energy efficient because if you look at sauropods, with their efficient breathing, their metabolism was also very efficient. How food was being converted into energy without a lot of waste. These sauropods grew very quickly when they were young. That was another thing because they had a laminar bone system. Laminar bone system usually helps in more and rapid bone development. So the youngers would become bigger much quicker. And with this, they also had a really efficient digestion system. So all in all these physiological evidences sort of point towards them being gigantic. Another big thing was that the sauropods used to have smaller heads because they never really chewed their food. A bigger head usually meant that they needed a bigger jaw, they needed more teeth, and they needed more bite force. But the sauropods had smaller heads because, well, they usually just swallowed the leaves they ate and they let the stomach do all the digestion. That's why they were also carrying big stomachs, right? So you would see that a lot of evolutionary processes were going into these dinosaurs becoming big. It's the same way how you would look at a giraffe. You know that giraffes usually they developed a longer neck because they wanted to reach the nutrients which were situated on the top foliage of trees. With bigger necks, they were needed to develop bigger bodies to support that bigger neck, right? Same thing was happening here. So if sauropods became big, the other dinosaurs, the predators, the theropods had to become big as well, because if they had to hunt down these big dinosaurs, uh, just through the process of natural selection, you would have that the smaller predators would not be able to they won't be able to kill the bigger dinosaurs, so the predators had to become bigger through natural selection. And similarly, through natural selections, the smaller dinosaurs won't survive the predators, so they also had to become larger. So the answer to gigantism somewhere lies in the biological evolutionary process of natural selection, as well as their whole evolution being supported by the environment and the resources that was provided by the environment. I know this was a lot of jargon, but at the end of the day, this is what evolution does, right? Evolution is nothing but a means to survive, and if the means of survival required them to be bigger, they became bigger. So that sort of concludes our story of what was happening on Earth during this time period. Now, for more than 99.9% of Earth's existence, there were no humans. You and I come into the picture way later. And the recent rise of Homo sapiens may be traced back to the rodent-like survivors of that rogue Manhattan-sized asteroid that collided 65 million years ago. Now, within a few million years or so, the dinosaurs' demise, you would have mammals which had radiated into vacant ecological niches, to fields and jungles and mountains and deserts. And even so, the last 65 million years may have not been easy, because we know that there were other extinction events that happened. We know that many of these strange and wonderful new mammals died in mass extinction events of 56 million years ago, then 37 million years ago, and then finally 34 million years ago. So humans ultimately descended from the survivors of the last of those catastrophic events. Monkeys, the great apes, and us, we all point to a common primate ancestor, which was about 30 million years ago or so. The first hominids, the evolutionary family that includes primates who walk erect, arose perhaps 7 million years ago in Central Africa. And this is the story which I want to tell you from the next episode onwards, where we look at Sahelanthropus. Sahelanthropus is supposed to be the last common ancestral fossil of primates and us humans, how we become humans. And yeah, so that's where we'll pick up in the next episode. I know that this episode we have traveled a lot. We came from 540 million years ago or so to now coming directly to about 8 or 7 million years ago, where we'll start looking at human evolution. But let me tell you, the story of human evolution is even more interesting, because, you know, this whole theory of evolution has always been questioned, because this is a time period where you start looking at certain religious scriptures and how the creation of man and the creation of women and the creation of our species, the species of humans, is often alluded to some mystical event. But we know that through evolution, through the fossils that we have discovered, that's not the case. There is a clear, marked evolutionary pathway that us humans have taken, and that's exactly what I want us to trace in the next episode. So again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Itihas podcast. My name is Arnapati, and if you have any doubts, make sure you mail me. My email ID will be there in the description of the podcast, wherever you're listening to. And I will also make sure that I put in all the resources that I have used. And if there's anything else, make sure you don't hesitate. Just reach out and we'll have quite an amazing conversation. And to those who have listened to me till this point, you who's listening to me right now, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope you out there have an amazing rest of the week ahead. And I'll see you in the next episode.